Hey, this is Cedric, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the electrifying world of finance and economics in the Dollar Endgame, financial gravity and the Fed's dilemma with Peruvian Bull, as we explore the inevitable negative feedback loops of Keynesian economics, modern monetary theory, the Triffin dilemma, the deindustrialization of America, and unravel the mysteries of the Federal Reserve's event horizon. This episode is brought to you by River, the financial institution built for all time. Dollar cost average with zero fees. Smooth out the price volatility of Bitcoin and get zero fees on your Bitcoin purchases when you set up recurring orders. Mine Bitcoin and get daily Bitcoin payouts. River manages the end-to-end mining process for you, including procuring, hosting, and maintenance. With River, your Bitcoin is your Bitcoin. Unlike other exchanges, River builds security into every product and service for your peace of mind. River has 100% full reserve custody. All Bitcoin on River are held one-to-one. River does not use or lend your Bitcoin. Buy and build your Bitcoin wealth with a Bitcoin-focused company. Use the link in the show notes to get started and get $5 in BTC when you buy $100 worth of Bitcoin. And for the ultimate in Bitcoin security and design, get the Cold Card hardware wallet from CoinKite. With built-in sleep-at-night technology, it's the only dedicated air-gapped, ultra-secure signing device for Bitcoin. CoinKite is a leader in security and hardware manufacturer, established block 141,000, and maker of some of the most iconic Bitcoin products. Don't trust, verify. Use the link in the show notes for a discount. Join us as we discuss the sword of Damocles hanging over the Treasury and unravel the mysteries of the Federal Reserve's event horizon. And prepare yourself for a thought-provoking conversation with Peruvian Bull that explores the overwhelming strength of financial gravity and the hard choices that lie ahead.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Peruvian Bull is a Peruvian-American scholar, researcher, and educator hailing from the Pacific Northwest. Born and raised in Seattle, he attended a local university where he graduated Magna Cum Laude with degrees in finance, economics, and entrepreneurship. He has studied also in South America and plans to complete a master's degree at the London School of Economics. He currently works at a private equity fintech firm as an analyst and advisor for financial services. Peruvian Bull, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Two things to note there. I myself, I never know how to pronounce this. Is it Magna Cum Laude or Loud? I think that's what I graduated. I just never have to say it out loud often, but congratulations on that. And, I didn't mention, the Dollar Endgame, which is, a big reason we're here to talk and kind of your opus. And you have the website, the book, the threads, the Medium site, a lot of Substack. Yeah. So I'd love to get into all of that. But what is your background, or at least as much as you could share with us? Like, I know you've been studying this stuff, but how did you start writing about it and picking up this thread and kind of going at this angle, and what compelled you to kind of be a more public speaker on this and writer?
Sure. Well, that's a very long story, dating it all the way back to my childhood when I was first encountering the themes of macroeconomics and finance as a kid, and especially talking about them with my parents and my dad, especially, who's an atmospheric physicist, very, very bright, but he doesn't have any interest in learning this stuff. And so while I was learning it, I started explaining it to him, and started researching on my own and on the side to try to understand topics more deeply. And then in college, that's when I would say my interest went from just a side hobby to, I would say, close to an obsession. I watched The Big Short with one of my close friends and got thrown into the world of finance. I was initially actually going to college to be a biology major and a researcher. And I'd had an internship at the Center for Infectious Disease Research. And I was going down that path, and I was headed headlong to become either a doctor or a researcher. And I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do in life. And I was finding that the, finance and macroeconomics was just much more interesting and fulfilling to me. And so throughout my college career, I didn't only go to the classes and pay attention and try to learn as much as I could. I also did a ton of research on the side. And that culminated in me starting to develop what is currently my thesis, which is the Dollar Endgame. And this thesis was percolating in my head, and I was working on it, and I was thinking about it. And it was, I was reading, a ton about the global monetary system, about Triffin's dilemma, about the issues with reserve currencies, about the issues with the US debt spiral, all these dynamics, and especially Keynesian and Austrian economics. And in 2021, after the GameStop fiasco, I started posting on Reddit, which is where I first got my notoriety. And on there, I found an unlikely band of allies, of people who are disenfranchised from our, financial system, just as I was, and angry at how things had turned out with the GameStop situation, and how the hedge funds had essentially allowed, or I guess pushed or lobbied, the DTCC and Robinhood and the brokers to shut down trading. And so when I started posting there, I started to get some pull, some notoriety. And ironically, I actually posted the first part of Dollar Endgame not thinking I would write anything more. I just wanted to put it out there. And it got so much positive feedback, negative pushback as well, but a lot of positive feedback. So I just kept on writing until I wrote the entire series and wrote the final piece in December of 2022, or as well as November of 2022. And then I published the book in January of this year, January and February. And so that's kind of like how I came to understand it. And in my professional life, where I work as a fintech analyst and helping companies derive their valuations and price their equity options, I've also, kind of done work on the side at work to talk to other people and discuss with other intelligent people what is going to happen with our monetary system and what do the changes look like moving forward. Because most of the traditional, even though I work at a fintech firm, which is much more progressive and forward thinking than most finance companies, they're still extremely behind the curve when it comes to Bitcoin education and just understanding blockchain technology. And, earlier this year, I joined the crypto segment. So the way our valuations department is structured is there's different segments for different industry verticals. And so one is for crypto, and I joined the crypto segment. And I was surprised when, even with just my cursory understanding of Bitcoin, I knew more than the sector lead, who had basically not even read the Bitcoin Standard or almost any book on Bitcoin. And so I was pretty surprised by that. But that's common in the financial sector. Most people are very dismissive of Bitcoin and blockchains in general. So
yeah. Well, you definitely have a firm grasp on a lot of these subjects. And I am a little curious, though, because it seemed that like Bitcoin came a little bit later into your work and your thinking. And not a lot of people are constantly thinking and analyzing the monetary system. Most people are thinking about their money, how to get more money, even at fintech companies or, traditional finance. What was the reaction like on Reddit, or what was the discussion? I know that you had a fantastic, feedback and maybe a little bit of pushback, but what was the topics that really lit people maybe interest, and where did people push back?
People were fascinated by the similarities between the US and Rome. And that was especially laid out in my first part, A New Rome, my first chapter, A New Rome, where I call them parts or sections because they were kind of big. And especially what I tried to lay out was just the startling amount of similarities between us and ancient Rome. I mean, the Roman ocula, which was the standard of the centurions, is used on the top of American flags. For example, in the Boy Scouts or at military installations or in, government buildings. And most of our academic and, governmental institutions are modeled after the Romans. And the Romans had a similar issue that the United States faced, which is as you grow larger and larger as a empire, which essentially was the part of the thesis of that first chapter, is we have become an empire because of our massive, what is called the exorbitant privilege, what French finance minister in Gustave d'Estaing, or I think that pronouncing that horribly, but that's he called it the exorbitant privilege in 1960 in a meeting with President Kennedy, because it confers upon the U.S. a massive amount of buying power that it wouldn't necessarily get if it was any other nation. And Rome had the same benefit. It had the same strength of the empire network effect of trade to continually drive resources into it, and allow it to continue expanding. But at a certain point, this benefit becomes a drawback, because the size of the empire itself and the amount of resources that it takes to command and to maintain that size of empire becomes overwhelming. And the decisions made by those in power become lower and lower fidelity and lower accuracy as time goes on, right? Because they have not, now the people coming into power didn't work to earn or to build the state that has been, that has earned that power. And so they are now almost like the spoiled rich kids coming to handle the family business. They don't understand the complexities and the dynamics of their own institution that they're governing, or the state that they're governing. And so that was where people really liked the similarities. The pushback was, and again, I've had this a lot, which is, we've heard this before. You keep saying there's exponential inflation coming. Peter Schiff said the same thing in 2010. Robert Kiyosaki has been parroting this. All the libertarians have been parroting this. You're saying the same fear-mongering gold bug, right? Neo-Austrian bullshit is what they, lightly termed it, that everyone has been saying for years. And so you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about, and there won't be exponential inflation, and there won't be, a crisis of reserve currencies. And my point was that this time they are wrong. And this time the exponential inflation thesis is correct. And it's correct for the first time in a long time, because of the dynamics of, the slow erosion of power of the US as a world reserve currency, and the debt spiral and the nature of QE. When you get into the nitty and gritty of how QE works and how Treasury deficit spending works, you will understand that QE, when it's paired with Treasury deficit spending, is actually additive to the money supply, especially to the real money supply, which is what actually matters for us in the normal economy. And I've had this argument with a ton of people. I think it's fascinating to me that they don't get it. They lay out the building blocks, they give you the little pieces, and then they can't put the whole thing together. And so that's what my work tries to do. And I think that's what people really push back on the first one. And I actually wrote a whole addendum to my entire series with all the rebuttals and counter arguments and how I would respond to them. And so that's at the very back half of the book.
Awesome. Maybe we'll get into that a little later, or maybe we'll come now. I think some of the pushback comes from a lot of what we're talking about now will feel very similar to 2008.
Yeah.
It probably is very different or more extreme or more exponential, but and that was able to be kind of, they were able to kick the can down the road. And so I think a lot of people think that there's a lot of potential for them to kick the can down the road here again for however many years. What I also think about when we talk about empire, are we talking about the United States and in the sense of the Federal Reserve, or is it like the Western central banks? And when did the empire start? Is it when we sort of went on Bretton Woods, or is it 1776? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, look, that's a hard question. Historians will debate, for example, when World War II actually started, because some people would date it to the annexation of Czechoslovakia, right, the Sudetenland, or they could date it to the invasion of Poland, or you could even date it, 10 years earlier with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. But when you think about the U.S. as an empire, I would agree that the true empire status would probably come in around 1945, 1946, post-World War II. But the U.S. was displaying imperialistic desires as early as 1900, 1901. Because, after the Spanish-American War, and after our, I guess you'd call it annexation or conquest of Puerto Rico and ownership of Puerto Rico as a as a territory, the U.S. began to take on, imperialist or, mercantilist beliefs and, I guess, motives in their governmental structure. In the early 1900s, for example, our trade minister went to basically demonetize the Philippine economy by taking the Spanish or the Mexican peso out of circulation. And same thing happened in Puerto Rico, because at the time, the Mexican peso was the most commonly used form of silver in the world. And silver was basically, the de facto currency, because it was, small enough and divisible enough for trade, but still valuable enough and rare enough to be, considered a full-on monetary metal. And so they concocted several schemes. They tried several times to get, for example, the Philippines to demonetize silver. And their first several attempts were unsuccessful, but they were eventually successful by introducing silver-backed, U.S. dollars backed with Mexican pesos in the Philippines, and then slowly, taking the pesos out of circulation until it was a full paper fiat-backed economy. And so if you, again, it's hard to debate when the U.S. started to take on this monetarist empire, regime, but I would say you could date it as early as, 1901.
Right. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the central banks are trapped in a black hole of their own design. They will soon be forced to choose which to save, their currencies or the system itself. So how are the Federal Reserve and the Treasury trapped beyond the event horizon? What is this financial gravity you speak of?
Sure. So financial gravity, that's one of the chapters of my book. And basically what it's trying to do is explain what I would call the paradoxical and self-defeating feedback loops that Keynesian economics and, modern monetary theory runs into. And, to lay it out most simply, the Keynesians and the modern monetary theorists believe that interest rates are the key to, all economic growth. So as interest rates rise, the economy constricts, lending starts to, constrict, banks start to stop, lending against assets, asset values start to fall, companies start to lay off workers, defaults happen, and then the reverse happens on the uptrend. And this cycle of the credit cycles happen for, thousands of years. And the small credit cycles every 8 to 10 years, and the long credit cycles is every 80 years and 90 years. And their goal, starting in, I would say, the burgeonings of this were in the 1940s, but it really started to accelerate in the 70s, post the inflationary crisis caused by the oil shocks and by the Vietnam War. They wanted to, quote, like what they called manage economic growth or manage the business cycle. So they wanted to defeat it by raising rates into economic booms to slow it down, and to lower rates into economic busts to keep, the recession from getting too severe. And you can see this if you look up a chart of the federal funds rate, right? In 1980, the federal funds rate hit a cycle high of like 18%. By 1981, of 1981, it had fallen to about 6%, and then they had to hike it back to 18% about 3 or 4 months later. And then leading up to the 1990s, they were able to get it. They did a lowering cycle again, a cutting cycle, and then they were able to get it up to 6.5%. And then, post the 1992 recession, they lowered it again. They hike it, then they have to lower it after the tech bubble pops. And then they're able to raise it to 5% or 5.25%. I think that's where it is in 2007, August 2007, before they began cutting. And then they had it pinned to the zero bound for almost a decade. And so what this process does is in this, what I call the vain attempt to manage the credit cycle, instead of allowing these bad businesses to die and these bad debts to go bust and to be extinguished, by lowering rates, they're keeping these companies alive and keeping the debts, viable in the system. And they're spurring the credit growth of new debt as the economy should be rolling over and getting into recession. And when you're at 30% debt to GDP, that's not a huge issue. You're adding a bit more debt, but people can afford it. At 40, at 50, at 70%, it's still manageable. But as you go down this road, what you start doing is you start, accumulating this, what I call, again, financial mass, this debt mass that's added onto the economy, and which with each new unit of debt that's created, and makes it that much harder to raise interest rates the next time. So the next cycle, they can't go as high in their hiking cycle, and then they have to drop them lower and keep them lower for longer the next time they cut. And so this feedback loop starts to develop where they have to go lower because they don't want to, incur debt defaults, and then that creates more loan demand, which creates more debt, which means that they can't hike as high the next time, which means less debt will be extinguished, which means that they have to, lower it even harder the next time. And you see this crisis start to build loads in every sector of the economy, in auto loans, in mortgages, in student loan debt, right? In federal debt, in municipal debt, in corporate bond markets. It just starts to grow and grow and grow. And the more that they subscribe to their own models and the more they follow their own Keynesian thinking, the further they get, the further they go down this rabbit hole towards the black hole, and the larger the mass becomes. And so the problem is you can do this for a long time, and you can do this especially to the private sector, especially the financial institutions, because when you bail out financial institutions through the MAP, you don't actually, what you're doing is you're creating bank reserves that are bailing out these banks and propping up financial assets again. So it's really easy to, quote, reflate the bubble. The issue is once you do this to the treasury or to, a large governmental institution, then you started to run into the issue of, well, what happens when the treasury is so underwater that if we raise rates, we bankrupt the federal government? And this is what I call, the Fed's trilemma. They're stuck. They've lowered the interest rates for so low for so long that they trapped the treasury in this black hole. And the black hole is this black hole of debt, and they're beyond the event horizon for multiple reasons. But for one, because the true interest expense on the debt, which is recorded as entitlement spending plus defense plus true real interest paid, was 111% of gross federal tax receipts in 2021. And Luke Gromen pointed this out in an interview in October on Macro Voices. And that should have shocked everyone in the financial world and should have been a huge red flag and a huge signpost. But it seems like that mostly went by unnoticed. And so what my writing tried to point out is this is, if they're at 111% of true interest expense to tax receipts, that means that all their earnings can't pay the true interest on the debt. And as this was written, almost 2 years ago in October of 2021, as we're talking today, the debt crisis has, gotten much, much worse. In the past trailing 12 months, there's been $852 billion of interest expense incurred by the Treasury. And just since the beginning of the year, it's been about $630 billion. And for June, 18% of tax outlays or federal outlays were towards interest. And so we're running into a situation now where for the first time ever, the U.S. is going to pay more than $1 trillion in interest alone on our debt. And like I've said, we're already beyond the event horizon in one sense, that we're beyond the event horizon for true interest expense, if you count, the unabilities. But once you count the real nominal expenditures, we're going to reach that in just a few years at current rates. And so once that happens, all federal tax receipts will only go to pay interest, which means the debt will never be paid off and it will just be monetized. And my entire point with the series is that, guys, I like to think that this is a linear process and a slow decline. It's not. It's an exponential process because that's how markets work and that's how compounding interest works.
Wow. You pulled from Artemis Capital Research's paper an interesting quote, and I want to read that here. In their masterwork tapestry entitled Allegory of the Prisoner's Dilemma, the artists Diaz, Hope, and Roth visually depict a great tower of civilization that rests upon a bedrock of human cooperation and competition across history. The artists force us to confront the fact that after 10,000 years of human civilization, we are now at a crossroads. Today, we have the highest living standards in human history that coexists with an ability to destroy our planet ecologically and ourselves through nuclear war. We are in the greatest period of stability with the largest probabilistic tail risk ever. The majority of Americans have lived their entire lives without ever experiencing a direct war, and this is, by all accounts, rare in the history of humankind. Does this mean we are safe, or does the risk exist in some other form, transmuted and changed by time and space, unseen by most political pundits who brazenly tout perpetual American dominance across our screens? It's kind of interesting to think about how much comfort we have and how maybe little gratitude we have for it, or how maybe arrogance, or maybe how ignorant we are to how quickly things can change. What is the Triffin's dilemma? Because it seems like that's part of what's getting us into this quandary.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1960, economist Robert Triffin goes in front of Congress and lays out what he finds to be the quintessential problem with the US dollar as the reserve currency. And this is would later be called Triffin's dilemma. At the time, it was just called the paradox. And it essentially states that the US has two options. As a global reserve currency, the issue is there's international demand for the dollar. So other countries, because they use the dollar in trade, because they use the dollar as their central bank reserve asset, because it's used to settle debts, because it's loaned into existence in the Eurodollar market, it needs to be, thus dollars need to be extinguished. The US has to be a net exporter of dollars. And what that means is that the US has to be a net importer of goods. And so the implications are multifaceted, but one of the largest ones and most poignant ones is that we will have to export our manufacturing base overseas over time, not immediately, but as global trade grows, because we need to be a supplier of dollars to the global economy, we need to be a net importer of goods. So we need to run trade deficits. So we need to export our manufacturing base overseas. But it also means that we have to create more dollars than would otherwise be justified by our reserve ratio. So this is part of the reason why Nixon went off the gold standard in 1971. As the global economy began to grow and recover post-World War II, and especially the Eurodollar system began to develop, and loans that were being created, in Europe or in Asia or in Africa even, by the IMF or the World Bank or any other financial institution, HSBC, and they make these loans in dollars because they don't want to take the local currency as payment. These new entities need dollars in order to service their own debt and to just settle global trade. And so these dollars start to get sucked out of the US at an increasingly rapid rate. And the US has this dilemma, which is we can either choose to export these dollars and to keep funding, this dollar deficit, or dollar surplus that we're pushing overseas to these other countries, or we can choose not to. And the ramifications are huge for either problem. Because if we choose to, what we're doing is we're funding the world with all these dollars, we're printing them out of thin air, and we're diluting our own reserve ratio to gold. And so while gold was pegged at $35 an ounce, that means there's a fixed number of dollars that can be created, but the system demands more than a fixed number of dollars. The system demands an increasing amount of dollars and a rapidly increasing amount of dollars as global trade grows. And so we can fund these this demand. We can keep sending dollars overseas, but what that will do is that will drain our or that will reduce our reserve ratio, which eventually meant we drained our gold reserves because people started calling our bluff. The French Prime Minister Charles de Gaulle did the calculus in 1965, and he realized that we had issued something like 3 times as many dollars as was justified by our reserve ratio to gold. And so he started to withdraw his gold, and same with several other nations. And this, ended in 1971, quite cinematically with, French ships in the New York harbors trying to take gold from the Fed and gold from the Treasury, and them being denied, and Nixon coming and closing the gold window temporarily, and then deciding to make that temporary window closing permanent. And so that's our one option if we keep exporting dollars. The other option is that we don't export these dollars. And the problem with that is that this causes huge issues in international trade. For one, there's not enough dollars to settle trade, but for two, there will be massive defaults and currency crises as all these other countries that owe dollars aren't able to pay them, and they have to devalue their own currency against the dollar to buy dollars. They have to print their own money, buy dollars on the foreign exchange markets, and then use it to service their debt if they don't want to default. And so that's the paradox. That's the dilemma. There's no easy road. Either way leads to eventual, systemic long-term issues with the global reserve currency. And we, of course, chose the route of funding the deficits, of funding the dollar deficits, and continually pushing money out into the global system. But what that has caused is some serious instability in the global financial markets, some serious, imbalances, I would say, in the global economy. And one can be seen by, the net international investment position, which is, negative 60%. So that means that foreigners own something like $20 trillion more of U.S. assets than we own of foreigners' assets. And so a lot of the real estate, a lot of the bonds, a lot of the stocks in the financial markets of the U.S. are actually owned by foreigners because they receive dollars for creating real goods, and they plow these dollar surpluses back into the U.S. financial system. And so all these imbalances are not good in the long run, and they're not sustainable. And so what that piece was trying to kind of lay out was that even though we've been conferred this benefit of cheap consumer goods and, cheap manufactured goods from the third world by nature of the fact that we are a reserve currency and we are allowed to borrow more and issue more debt, and our assets are pumped to higher levels than other countries. Even though that's the case, it also builds a systemic risk, because now there's trillions of dollars of treasuries and financial instruments held by foreigners all around the world. And if the US dollar loses reserve currency status, which could happen, again, it's a non-zero possibility, even for the most permanent macro bulls, then you run into the issue of what happens to the reserve asset when $7 trillion of treasuries is fire sold. And that is not a situation that anyone wants to walk into. And that's kind of what I coined the sword of Damocles. In a later paper that I wrote in October of 2022, I discussed this risk in depth, and I was basically making the case that if this happened, again, if a new reserve asset emerges and is adopted widespread by the global community, the decline in the US dollar won't be, linear. It's going to be parabolic, because all these countries will dump their treasuries to switch to the new reserve asset. And then who's going to buy the treasuries? And so that's kind of the sword of Damocles. That's the risk that lies, unseen by the political pundits who continually tout our dominance.
Right. Yeah, I can see how that's, a little dicey to play out there. So let's say you're the president of a country like Liberia,
mm-hmm.
and you're looking to enter global trade. What kind of predicament does all this put you in?
Well, you have to acquire dollars somehow. And so as you're the president of this country, and I get that reference, because the graphic I made for dollar recycling in my book and also in my series is using Liberia as an example. As you're president of this country, you need to have a central bank, which means you need to go to the IMF, and you need to, create your own currency. First of all, create your own central bank, and then you need to go to the IMF usually and get dollar loans. And you also need to start exporting real goods. So that means your economy has to become very productive and has to ship usually cheap consumer goods, cheap commodities to the United States or to other, dollar surplus exporting nations in order to start gaining a dollar surplus so that you can actually trade, right? And the more you go down this path, especially if you're going down the dollarization path, the more you're trapped into this system kind of as a vassal state to the United States. Because as you get more and more integrated with trade with the United States, you gain more and more of a dollar surplus, right? Which means you invest more and more in treasuries, invest more and more in, U.S. financial instruments. And so your economy becomes increasingly interlinked with the U.S. And if you try to do anything to get off of it, now you have a huge amount of assets at stake, and your network effect of trade can be severely hampered, because if you try to drop the dollar, try to get off of this system, you'll lose about 80% of your trading partners, because 80-90% of global trade is done in dollars, invoiced and settled in US dollars. And so you don't have the ability really to get off the system. Once you join the club, it's the Hotel California. You're allowed to check out, but you're never allowed to leave. And so as you enter the system and go deeper and deeper into, the dollar system, you're taking steps that you cannot easily, untake. You can't take back. And, as this system, like we said, as it grows, and so you're lowering interest rates just de facto by creating this demand for US dollar bonds. And you're allowing the US to continue perpetuate and grow the system. And so again, you're running into the same dilemma as the Treasury is, which is you're helping the Treasury get into an unsustainable debt situation, which eventually will break something. And the key word is eventually. It's not an overnight process for sure. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that when I say, the dollar endgame is coming or the dollar endgame is here. It is a process. But as we can see, the macro events of 2022 and 2023 are kind of confirming, in my opinion, my thesis.
Right on. So, taking that further though, so if you're forced into the system and, you can check out but never leave, but now what happens when you're in the system? So I'm going to read a little bit from one of your threads. The dollar is the world reserve currency. This grants immense geopolitical and economic hegemony to the United States. But Treasury wants to keep their Excalibur a secret. Most Americans today walk around aware of the fact that they are a superpower. Military parades, fighter jet flyovers at football games, and clips showing American soldiers engaging enemy combatants are commonplace. However, what most Americans do not know is the secret mighty Excalibur that the U.S. government wields in order to achieve most of its ends, the dollar itself. Since the end of World War II, many conflicts have been resolved through sanctions and negotiation at the direction of the United States. In almost every case, the U.S. has used the Treasury and its control over the banking system to effectively choke and strangle powerful opponents without ever firing a single shot. So a lot of people are like, all right, well, what does that mean? I mean, how do we wield all this power without even using our military? And, okay, great. So it's the dollar, but what does that mean? What is SWIFT? And how is that a weapon?
Sure. So SWIFT, and actually this came into the fore when Russia, February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the global community, of course, immediately just responded with anger and derision as it's justified. But they also worked to get Russian banks out of the SWIFT network. And SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide, I think, Interbank Financial Telecommunications. And basically what SWIFT is, most people think it's an actual settlement network. That's incorrect. It's actually a communication network between banks. But the reason why it's so important is because it's a secure kind of decentralized system that allows banks to verify if payments are true. So if I send Cedric Jungelman a payment, I say, okay, debit my account X dollars and credit Cedric's account X dollars, and here's my account number and here's his account number. And the SWIFT payment network allows these two banks, our two correspondent banks, to communicate with each other securely and verify that the balances on each other's are there on each other's balance sheets, and that the account numbers are valid. And without that, you have a very messy situation of trying to for each bank trying to verify account numbers and balances manually, which is extremely slow. And so being banned from SWIFT network doesn't mean like your bank doesn't work. It just means your bank is sent back to like the 1970s in terms of efficiency. So, but that's almost equivalent to, sending your bank back to the stone age. Because if you have a choice between clearing all your transactions digitally and in a secured way versus annually with people trying to call another bank and verify things, I think, the answer is pretty clear. But the reason why that this is such a powerful weapon is because all US dollars globally have to be cleared through the US banking system because they have to be fungible with, a domestic US dollar. And so that means if you have a bank in Kazakhstan who is making payment to a bank in Russia, even though these two banks are not located anywhere near the US, the dollar transaction has to go through either a commercial bank and their balance sheet, or it has to go through a Fed master account. And with a commercial bank, it's indirectly going through a Fed master account. And so with the power of the global reserve currency, and with the dollar being 80% of global trade, this means that basically the economic activity in the entire world is viewable by the Treasury, right, and the Fed, because they can see these transactions happening. And now some of these ledgers are hidden on the bank's internal side. Some of these ledgers are, like we said, they're owned, like the Fed's master subpoena the bank or try to get the bank to open up their books if the transaction just happened, through a correspondent bank. But it means that all dollar transactions settle through the U.S. financial system. And so if the U.S. Treasury, the Office for Foreign Asset Control, wants to censor somebody, they can literally go and say, these 15 accounts are not, these will not be accepting dollars anymore and not be able to send dollars anymore. And so send out a message to the entire financial system, deny any, transfers that happen here. And so this has, of course, you can see this in, for example, our unilateral sanctions on Iran, our unilateral sanctions on Russia, on North Korea. And I'm not saying that these nations are good. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that you can see that this censorious power that the U.S. Treasury holds is actually very powerful and very scary for a nation or an individual acting against U.S. So-called U.S. interests. And in that piece, I lay out, there's several examples. One was BNP Paribas, which is a French bank in 2014 that was trying to settle dollar transactions to Iran. And they were fined $6 billion for doing so. And a UK banker, the same thing happened to HSBC and the Royal Bank of Scotland. They got fined money for transferring, funds from Germany, from a German banker to, an Iranian who was trying to build an oil project. And so, that banker had said, how dare you, who are you to tell us who we can do business with? And this sentiment is actually pretty common outside the U.S. financial system. Other countries, financial elites understand how powerful this censoring, ability is, this Excalibur, the secret weapon that Treasury doesn't want anyone to know exists, because it allows them to unilaterally impose U.S. policy on people who don't follow our policy. So Germany and France and Great Britain or the UK had no such sanctions against Iran, but we did. And so we were able to tell them, no, your bank can't go there and you can't do business with Iranians because we said so. We didn't take this to the UN. We didn't take this to their, to their government officials or to the parliament, right? Or to the EU. We just said, you're not doing this, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Wow. So, it makes me think, the U.S. government has, the ultimate master node and has built the greatest proof of stake network
ever.
Yeah. And, that really makes me wonder about this inflection point. Will there ever be, when I'm talking a larger proof of stake network, could something like ETH one day, I'm not comparing it to Bitcoin. I'm not getting into proof of stake versus proof of work. But could there ever be a bigger proof of stake network than this? I don't think so. I think this is the climax. I think when this crashes, it will take all other proof of stake networks down with it. And I don't think anything will supersede, or I don't think there'll ever be a flippening on proof of stake networks versus the US dollar ever. Mm-hmm. And you wrote, imagine if China had this power and demanded that Canada could not trade with Taiwan, cutting both countries off from the international monetary system. If they did so, what about Russia and Iran? I mean, this is just an incredible amount of power, within one node. And I can see how, we as Americans, we being the general, not you necessarily you or I, but we live under this umbrella of that master node in a lot of regards. And so I could see, if you're not in the node, how you would see it a lot more clearly. But, looking inward to the node and how the node affects inside and out, how is the Federal Reserve, responsible for far more of the evils in this world than we could possibly imagine?
Sure. So it sounds like you're just loving my threads, and all the stuff I've written. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I love your ideas and what you're putting forward. So, we're here to get into it.
Sure. Well, so again, this is the issue I started running into when I was, starting college, and especially starting to get fascinated by macroeconomics and finance. And the issue was, I saw very clearly and very early on that the economics professors and the finance professors were so obsessed with the abstraction of reality, which is the financial markets and the financial system and securities and debt, than they were with the actual economy and the real world, right? In 1985, a philosopher named Jean Baudrillard, and I'm probably butchering that name again because he's French, he wrote a work called Simulacra and Simulacrum. And in it, he laid out this story of a king who asked these magic cartographers to draw a map. And they essentially draw a map so large and so accurate that it can cover his entire kingdom. And on this map is every single tree, every person, every house, right? Every vehicle, or I guess carriage in that time, because this is more Middle Ages. And they lay this map over the entire kingdom. And the people start to live on the map. And after a generation or two, they forget that there's even a reality, a base reality, and they think that the abstractions on the map are the real thing. And this is essentially what the Fed and what the Keynesians and what the Treasury and what government officials and, the elites at every higher education institution of the United States have done, is they have mistaken financial market performance and financial securities for the real thing, for actual productive growth and actual real goods. And so their quest is to lower interest rates and do QE and game the system to boost the abstraction instead of actually boosting the real economy and providing jobs and creating real productivity gains and growth. And so what this means is that in their quest to create the abstraction, to advance the abstraction, they've completely forgotten about the real economy and real people, you and me. Because all of their Keynesian theories and all their belief systems rest on the simulacrum. They think that by creating wealth effects, that by pumping up financial markets, by growing the amount of the balance you have in your Charles Schwab account, they think that will produce real economic growth instead of the other way around, which is what I thought is the real way, and what I still believe is the real way things work. Ironically, the real economy should drive the stock market, not the other way around. But they have mistaken this simulacrum for the real thing. And so their goal always and forever is not unemployment reduction. It's not inflation reduction. It's maintenance and continuance and growth of the simulacrum, which means of the financial markets and of financial wealth. And so lowering QE or doing QE, lowering interest rates, these activities, they don't really help the real economy. What they do is they help their financial markets, their financial instruments, and help their wealth balloon. And what this thread laid out is that a large part, in my opinion, a large part of the evils or the problems with our modern economy are to be laid at the foot of the Fed. By lowering interest rates and by running QE, they've stolen real productive wealth and real productive goods from real people and misplaced it into the hands of sycophants who stand closest to the money printer. So no longer the goal is to actually create real growth or real goods or useful services in the economy. The goal is to game the financial system, game the Fed, game the markets to make the most money. That's what the goal is, because that is what has become the real economy. And so this has left behind basically an entire generation of Americans. And so what the thread lays out is, first of all, the homeless crisis. The Fed began buying mortgage-backed securities for the government in its history in 2008, and it continues this to this day. It's bought something like $4 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, 3 or 4 trillion. It depends on how you measure it. If you include agency-backed securities and some other Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac securities that they've created, but 3 to 4 trillion, a huge amount, and they've pumped this into the housing market, which has priced homes out of the normal person's wages and normal person's buying power, and basically allowed people who already own homes, the people who are already asset owners, to have their wealth balloon. And so that's contributed to the housing and to the homeless crisis, especially because when you take an entire generation of people and you don't allow them to own homes, you don't allow them to build wealth, like real wealth, actually by working, you create a massive amount of, what I would call like economic malaise or economic depression. People don't feel like they have a chance. People don't feel like the game is rigged. They don't feel like nothing they do actually matters, because again, with rates where they currently are and incomes where they currently are and housing prices where they currently are, you can't afford a home on a single income. You probably even can't afford it on 2 incomes. It's very difficult. And so this has contributed to the homeless crisis, the drug crisis, and all these problems are self-perpetuating because as you increase the amount of homelessness and drugs in the community, crime proliferates, good businesses move out, which means less police presence, less social services, less, hospital workers, and that just makes the problem spiral even worse. And so the Fed in my opinion, helped to start and maintain this crisis and grow the crisis to its current proportions. And I also talk about, the misallocation of capital in that thread about how so much money was created and pumped into the tech firms that the tech companies became wealthy beyond their wildest imagination, while real economy companies, or real productive people weren't allowed to benefit from their gains and from their, the goods they produce. And so it's really sad to see. It's really I've called it a distortion or perversion of the real economy, of the real world, but it's what they're seemingly hell bent on. And they claim to care about the real economy, they claim to care about the real worker, but they don't actually, because when push comes to shove, when banks start to fail like they did in March and April of this year, they open up the QE lines and the asset lending facilities and they do it all over again. Because again, they don't, in my opinion, and I think the data backs me up, I don't think they actually care to the same extent that they do about the financial system, the financial, abstractions that they've created.
Yeah, when you look at, sort of the health and well-being of your constituencies, your citizens, your population, marriage is being delayed. You noted that couples typically only marry when they could afford their house. General rates of depression are rising. Humans are made for community, for intimacy. We need each other, and by pricing couples out of the housing market, destroying jobs and hiking asset prices, the Fed has seriously damaged the ability of young people to seriously date and have children. Thus, the birth rate is collapsing in the U.S. People are retiring later. The Social Security Trust Fund, most Americans rely on for their retirement, will run out of money in 12 years, and probably 1 year sooner than expected as of now. And just health and well-being is down. And you write, through the magic of QE, the Fed has exacerbated the worst homeless, mental health, and population crisis the United States has ever faced. These issues are incredibly complex and hard to remedy and may take decades to undo the damage. You go on to write in another piece, through this process, the United States was able to become the largest and most dominant military force in the history of man, able to fight simultaneous 2 theater wars with overseas supply lines. The Treasury could borrow and spend unimpeded by the normal constraints of market discipline that were hoisted on other countries. Despite not declaring war since 1941, the U.S. has been in a state of near continuous warfare. Most scholars tout the story of Rome as a tale of triumphalism, of valiant centurions battling in the steppes of Asia, of brilliant generals laying traps for enemy armies, of scheming senators fighting battles of political intrigue, and of a sophisticated and well-functioning empire that harnessed engineering to create marvels such as the Colosseum and the Roman aqueducts. More sober historians, however, point out that the story of Rome is one that also echoes a warning through the annals of history. A complex society with mighty political, legal, and financial institutions, supported by a massive military, fell not to a crushing enemy invasion, but to collapse and decay from within. An elite ruling class detached from the realities of daily life of the citizens oversaw an empire with growing income inequality, environmental degradation, political corruption, social deterioration, and economic despair, and did nothing to stop it. The Roman treasury, facing insurmountable debts from years of fruitless war, started clipping coins, an early form of currency debasement that led to the Roman denarii losing 25% of its value every year. This eventually led to uprisings in Roman provinces and the sacking of Rome, the coup de grace, the final nail in the coffin for what had become the decadent Western Roman Empire. It's hard not to see the similarities when read through like that, and it's striking, the economic despair. I think that still lies beneath the surface. I think people are working more jobs or taking on more debt. Things seem to be going on, somewhat normally out there. What do you make then of the political climate And maybe the subtext underlying that question is, we seem to get a sense, or you seem to put forth that, the Fed and Treasury know what they're doing, that they kind of know that they're playing their hand, and they got to kind of play on the fake map and let everyone believe that that's the real economy. Do you think presidents and political figures understand this stuff and are leading people astray, or are they just kind of with the people and don't understand it? Do you think they're playing the game? Do you think they're being? It was kind of like you noted that you laughed out loud when you heard Trump rail against our trade deficits in one of the 2016 presidential debates.
Mm-hmm.
And how you wrote he didn't understand how our system works, and that this issue was beneficial in the short term. And Trump's an interesting one in particular because he's very strong. He's very pro the dollar and anti things like Bitcoin. And do you think he understands things like the Fed and that this is the monetary system and monetary history and these things have cycles, or do you think he's just like, hey, we want a strong economy, I want to get reelected? Or and I'm not trying to get into Trump, but just political figures in general, do you think they know what's going on here, that they understand monetary history?
I think I would say for the vast majority of them, they don't. Unfortunately, there are some exceptions. I would say JFK was an exception. I'd say the current presidential candidate RFK is an exception, but the vast majority have very little to no understanding of our financial system, and mainly their goal is to just get reelected, and so they want to say things that are popular and that will inspire people to vote for them and to think that they're different than everyone else and that they'll actually make a difference in the system. But that particular quote that I said about Trump was me pointing out how he didn't understand how our trade deficits and how the dollar system works, that we need to continually export dollars to the global system on net to allow them to service their own debts and to just settle global trade. And so if he wanted to close the deficit forever, which is what he kind of claimed or alluded to claiming to do, that would be detrimental to the global economy, because then eventually there wouldn't be enough dollars to settle the debts. And so, we would begin running into, currency crises. And so most politicians, they just don't have, they have very, I would say, trite or tiny understanding of how this works. And most of their advisors are graduates of, the elite institutions of the United States that are pro-Keynesian, statist and pro-government, and they don't understand how the markets actually work. They have very, very few real market participants, advise them or inform them of what's going on. And so I think they're kind of like, bulls in a china shop breaking things, but they can afford to break things because they have a money printer.
Right. I want to read a little bit more from your work. So
at this rate, you're going to read the whole book.
You're prolific, so
thank you. I do write a lot. Yeah.
With a collapsing economy and slowly rising rent and home prices, dozens of thousands of people were pushed onto the streets each week and did not have a way back into housing. They turned to drugs, crime, and more to deal with the pain and anxiety. Economic self-reliance, especially for men, is closely linked to rates of depression and suicide. When the jobs in the city leave, the houses get too expensive to own, and the school tuition skyrockets. Many feel an overwhelming hopelessness and turn to self-destructive habits. The median American worker saw his bosses become enormously wealthy without additional work or effort put in, while his or her wages were stagnant for basically the entire decade. This further contributed to economic despair and gave people a sense of a rigged system, and that the American dream touted by the baby boomers and those before them was now dead. Upward mobility became increasingly difficult as home and asset prices rose without a corresponding increase in median wages. I think this really kind of captures, a lot of what's going on. I want actually a little bit more. Money is power, and power can buy many things, even the ability to influence minds. Young people nowadays are in most ways actually worse off than their parents. They can't buy a home, they can't afford school, they can't get a good job. And this issue is causing societal-wide consequences like a falling marriage and birth rate. And what I want to touch on, we haven't even gotten into the banking system. Like here, what's happening and how stretched this is getting. So can you tell me a little bit about what you're seeing with something like, a Silicon Valley bank and the reverse repo market?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you, brought that up. I'm glad you touched on, the final part that I wrote about the, homelessness crisis and the malaise, because I do believe that's real. And like I said, I believe that the Fed has attempted to remedy and, prioritize the financial markets over everything else. And in their desire to pump and, stimulate asset prices and financial instruments, they've created all these warps, all these gravitational fields throughout the banking system and throughout the financial economy. And so if you want to touch on the banking system, that's the first kind of warp they've created in their gravity field. In, late 2008, they, and early 2009, they had finally succeeded in dropping interest rates all the way to the zero bound. And they kept these there for like we said, almost a decade. And in late 2015, Janet Yellen decided to start hiking. And they were going to do this extremely slowly. They're going to raise rates by 25 bips and, take several years to get to their target rates. And inflation at the time was low and unemployment was still recovering from the Great Recession. And so they believed that they could just slowly ease their way into this situation. And in, 2018 and 2019, the United States, our national equity markets began to fall into bear market territory. So from August to mid-December, the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ entered technical bear market territory. And the what's it called? Russell 2000 went down 30%. And this was all on the back of the Fed's taper program, which they had claimed was on autopilot. And what Janet Yellen had said in September of 2017 was something that would continue until there was an exogenous shock to the system. And by December of 2018, the market rout had gotten so bad, and we had actually had the worst day in stock market history since the Great Depression, the worst Friday in stock market history, I should say, on December, I think this was December 24th, that Powell, the next press conference he was at, he claimed that they had re-examined the situation, that they would stop the taper. And that was enough to stop the financial markets from falling any further. And later that year, of course, there was a repo crisis, and then in later of 2019, we began actually doing QE even before 2020 and the coronavirus came. And then once the coronavirus came, QE went through the roof. And interest rates, of course, were pinned to the zero bound again. And so what this did is this huge amount of liquidity entering the system and this huge increase in bond prices and reduction in pinning of interest rates to the zero bound shoves all these bank reserves into the system and gets all these banks to buy bonds at the record high bond prices, which is inverse to the yield. So that means the record low yield rates. And because of Basel III regulations and because of just how bank balance sheets work, they're forced to buy all these duration assets and shovel all this money into their bond portfolios because there's not really any other place for them to put it. And so all these banks, plow this money into bonds. They plow this money into mortgage-backed securities. And then in March of 2022, the Fed begins the fastest hiking cycle that they've ever embarked on. And they begin ripping rates high, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, higher and higher and higher and higher, to the point where today we're at 5%. And that is a huge jump in interest rates in an extremely short amount of time, which means most of these banks were unprepared for the moves in the bond markets that came. And 2022 was the worst year for bonds in history. It was, an absolute blood. And a lot of these companies, a lot of these firms like SVB, for example, held a lot of what are called held to maturity securities. And held to maturity means they buy a bond and they are marking it on the balance sheet as holding it till it expires. And so they say, since we're holding it till it expires, one, we're not going to account for the losses, the unrealized losses of the bond on our balance sheet. And two, we're not going to hedge the interest rate exposure. So we're going to say, we have all these bonds, we have this huge bags, but we're not going to hedge any of the interest rates, and we're not going to get ready for a rise in interest rates because we're just quote unquote holding to maturity. And what they didn't realize was the shadow risk, which is so often their oversight, especially by bankers, was that the massive amount of money pumped into the financial system was concentrated mainly in the VCs and private equity markets, in terms of deposits. And so SVB, First Republic, right, these big banks to fail had a disproportionate amount of VCs and private equity money and startup, Y Combinator tech money than other banks did. And so when you have a huge deposit base that is mainly these large clients that's able to pull their money rapidly, you're able to see extremely quick bank runs. And Silicon Valley Bank failed in part because they had the largest and fastest bank run in history. Within 24 hours, I think something like $40 billion was withdrawn. And for a bank to withstand withdrawal redemptions of that size is impossible, which is why they failed. And I actually did a thread examining their financials right as they were collapsing. And they had something like if I recall the numbers right, it was like $13 billion of liquid cash. So if you have 13 billion and you get withdrawal redemption requests for 40, you're not making it to the end of the day. And that's why the FDIC took over on Friday. I think it was March 13th. And normally the FDIC will take over at the end of the day, or they'll wait till a weekend, right, to start wrapping up, closing the bank's books and start wrapping up the process or beginning the process of receivership. They closed them in the morning because they knew they wouldn't last till business, close to the business day. So it was an emergency situation. And that's, the FDIC, the FRC and SVB are not the only banks in this situation. If you look at some of the charts I've published or others have published, the losses on investment securities, which is basically bonds across the financial system, is huge. Some estimates put it as high as $2 trillion. And the higher the Fed raises rates, the bigger these unrealized losses become. And again, no one really knows how big they are because so many bonds are held to maturity, and therefore they are not, they're not required to report the unrealized losses. No one really knows the true extent of the damage that the Fed does with each hike. And so that's part of the reason why I say the Fed's days are numbered in terms of hiking, because they can't keep doing this. The large banks can't, withstand more and more and more interest rates. We can't take interest rates to 20% like Volcker did. So there's a cap on the ceiling of how high the Fed can hike. And like Jim Bianco says, and like others have said, the Fed will hike till they break something. And so we're just waiting to see what they're going to break next.
Right. Well, things are breaking. I want to read a little bit from part 2, the prologue. The Ouroboros, a Greek word meaning tail devourer, is the ancient symbol of a snake consuming its own body in perfect symmetry. The imagery of the Ouroboros evokes the concept of the infinite nature of creation from destruction. The sign appears across cultures and is an important icon in the esoteric tradition of alchemy. Egyptian mystics first derived the symbol from a real phenomenon in nature. In extreme heat, a snake, unable to self-regulate its body temperature, will experience an out-of-control spike in its metabolism. In a state of mania, the snake is unable to differentiate its own tail from its prey and will attack itself, self-cannibalizing until it perishes. In nature and markets, when randomness self-organizes itself into too perfect symmetry, order becomes the source of chaos, and chaos feeds on itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm thinking at this juncture, you're looking at all of this stuff. When I would be getting frustrated when I looked at this stuff, I was getting frustrated, because there's no solution per se. It's just this, this spiral that's happening, a downward spiral. You see it. Not everyone recognizes it. Not everyone's dealing with it, but it's happening. And what do you do? But when did Bitcoin come into all this for you?
Mm-hmm.
And what was your reaction to kind of coming across Bitcoin? And more so when you understood it and how it played into what you're examining here.
Sure. So I actually first got into Bitcoin in 2017. I attended a couple conferences and, I was fascinated by markets at the time. This was back when I was still in college. And so I was, getting more and more interested in how cryptocurrencies work, what they are. And so I started trading Bitcoin, and I made the genius decision to buy at 2000, and I sold all of what I had at 5, because my belief was that it was a bubble. This was a classic example of, a tulip mania, and that this was not going to last, and that everything was going to deflate, and, it's going to go to zero, like every other crypto is what I believed. And after I made that trade and then saw it run to 20K, and then I saw it run back down to like 4 or 5, I thought I was justified. And so I thought I can just ignore this, moving forward. And then in 2020 and 2021, I started to get reintroduced to Bitcoin by several acquaintances and friends, and especially by reading, several books like the Bitcoin Standard. And I started to realize that a lot of the problems that I was laying out with the global monetary system, especially like, for example, Triffin's dilemma, it's not only helped or remedied a little bit by Bitcoin, it's solved. Because Triffin's dilemma, one of the requirements for that dilemma is that you have a centrally issued currency, because you have an outside system. The outside nodes require more currency than the inside node has. So the inside node has to export currency, right? But what if you have a decentralized currency? What if you have a decentralized issuing currency, meaning there's no single node that issues all the currency? That means Triffin's dilemma is solved. There is no dilemma, because you don't have that prerequisite that creates the dilemma in the first place. And so when I realized that, I stopped in my tracks, I put the book down, and I said, holy crap. Like, oh my God, if this actually solves Triffin's dilemma, and this actually is a better monetary asset than anything ever created in human history, and this can actually have the volume, especially on the base chain, required for global trade, which it does. Again, I got kind of fudded out of Bitcoin because I thought 7 transactions a second at max, and with the max block size, that's not enough for all transactions globally. Visa does 7,000 a second. That's not going to work. Until I realized that the monetary system is layered in the sense that the largest transactions between central banks and large banks happen rarely. You only need to settle once a day or once every several days. So global trade can still be done on a base chain, and everyone else, which is 99.9% of economic activity and your daily life, is done with, microtransactions on a second layer network like Lightning. And so once I realized and I put those two ideas together, I completely flipped on my belief about Bitcoin. And I started writing about how Bitcoin could be the potential new reserve currency and how it could solve Triffin's dilemma. And basically, we could enter into a monetary system that starts to develop the same game theory, or I guess the inverse game theory that the US dollar faces itself, right? Instead of being so afraid to leave the system, countries become so afraid not to join that they're forced to join, and they start accumulating Bitcoin and using it for trade, and that brings the next country and brings the next country, and it creates this domino effect where Bitcoin spreads in global trade faster than what most people think is possible. Again, because all these countries are allowed to print their own money and use it to buy Bitcoin, they start and can start demanding Bitcoin in global trade. Bitcoin can gain global adoption much faster than most people think, especially if, and I said this to Marty Bent, especially if the Fed is the one to start the snowball. Because like we've touched on, the Fed is the central node. The Fed is the the ventilation shaft on the Death Star. The Fed is the nuclear heart of the fiat system. If you change the Fed, you essentially change everything overnight. And so if you get the Fed and Jerome Powell to just buy Bitcoin, and the Treasury as well, and start pushing us off the dollar standard, that will change everything. Now, I don't think that's going to happen for a lot of reasons. But for one, no one who owns and controls a monetary system is going to push into a monetary system they can't control and can't own. So the Fed's not going to do that. And neither is the Treasury, really, because again, these two entities are so large and so they're so hegemonic and so, they benefit so much from the system that as exists today. They don't have any real incentive to push something like a Bitcoin standard globally. But other small countries like El Salvador, the Central African Republic, obviously do. And if they start demanding Bitcoin in global trade or start using Bitcoin as their reserve asset for their central bank instead of dollars, that can start to change everything. And so that's when I started realizing the theoretical potential for Bitcoin, and the ability of Bitcoin to become a reserve asset, and how game changing that was for trade, and how that could cure a lot of the problems that we've talked about, right? You don't have to run huge trade deficits when you don't have Triffin's dilemma. And these other poor countries, like Alex Gladstein has pointed out, who have to, create resources, create commodities, build manufactured goods and ship them to the US, and lease their land to predatory corporations in order to do so, will no longer have to do it because they can just earn Bitcoin and trade with each other directly instead of having to rely on US dollar, the US dollar and the US government and political system.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So when thinking about the dollar endgame, and if you were explaining this to your dad,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, Dad, here, enter the dragon.
This is the final chapter.
So who is the dragon? I think about this as like, my son loves video games. He's now coding. He likes making video games, playing them. And there's always, the boss. You got to defeat the final boss.
Mm-hmm.
And, so the boss here is, I guess, the Fed or central banks, the dollar. But who's the boss slayer? Who's the dragon?
The dragon is inflation. The dragon is the consuming power of a feedback loop, kind of like what we touched on earlier, the Ouroboros, that has grown up and evolved to a point that it's unstoppable. And so what that piece tries to do, and again, you can see all this stuff on my website. You can see it. You can read the book. You can pick up a copy of the book if you want to read. That's the final chapter. What I try to do is show the inevitability of this dragon coming and demonstrate how powerless the federal government and the financial elites are at actually fighting it. And basically what I try to point out in that piece is, like we said earlier, the Treasury is trapped in a black hole, and they are trapped beyond the event horizon. And the Fed has designed this black hole. And the Fed has not only trapped the Treasury there, it's trapped a lot of major US corporations. It's trapped itself because, again, it can't raise rates really high enough to actually, create deflation or to stabilize inflation before things start blowing up. And everything that they do essentially will make the problem worse in the long run, right? I'm not saying the next 3 months. I can't give predictions for what happens over the next 3 months or the next 2 quarters, but we can talk about what happens in the long run. And in the long run, compounding interest is undefeated versus empires, period, point blank. And so the running into this issue of $200 trillion of unfunded liability, we're running into the issue of $32 trillion of federal debt that's coming due. And the interest on the debt at 5%, that equates to 1.6 trillion a year in interest expense. And the Happy Hawaiian pointed out on Twitter, and I've actually created a Twitter thread about this and a Substack post about this, which is called the Monetary Event Horizon, that kind of dissects the numbers and actually how it looks. The Fed has raised rates to fight inflation, and they have pushed, the risk curve up for everybody because now the Treasury has to refinance all the bonds at 5%. And to do this for a short time is fine. But if they want to hold rates here at 5% for a year or 2 years, which is what they're claiming to do, at least to fight inflation, they're going to be refinancing over half of the debt. And that means like we said, over $1 trillion in real interest expense every single year. And this problem will just keep growing and growing and growing because they're running into a dual issue. Their deficits are blowing out because the baby boomers are retiring and because, the military industrial complex is not expensive. And at the same time, their tax receipts are falling because they're hiking interest rates. They're lowering equity market prices. At least they did in Q4 of 2022, which means that there's less capital gains, and so they make less income. And, this was pointed out with, a couple charts, but the federal deficit this year so far is something like double where it was at this point last year. And we're not even, quote unquote, in a recession. So again, this begs the question, what's happening, right? Why are things starting to go so wrong if things are supposedly hunky-dory and we should see the world through rose-colored glasses? And that's what I call, them running into what I termed the Peruvian Bull debt paradox. Normal Keynesian thinking says raise interest rates, that will fight inflation. Lower interest rates, you can reinduce inflation and reflate the bubble. When the Treasury is the largest indebted entity in the system, raising rates only increases the amount of money the Treasury has to borrow, which only increases interest rates even more, which only means that they go deeper into the debt spiral, and it means that the Fed becomes closer to restarting QE. So the higher they hike, the further they move behind the curve. And like we've said, Treasury deficit spending increases M2. It increases the money supply because the Treasury creates a bond. It sells it. It sells it into existence, right? It borrows money into existence, and either central bank or primary dealer buys that bond with bank reserves, and those bank reserves gets transferred to the TGA, the Treasury General Account, which is their checking account, and it's spent because the Treasury spends real money. They take bank reserves and transform them into real money, and so this is a way for all these feedback loops that we've talked about. All the money that's been stored up in the financial system, all this cash that's locked in, bank reserves can now be transformed into real economy money and spent into real economy and shoveled into, the prices for real goods and services. And that causes inflationary feedback loops, which means the deficit gets worse, the borrowing gets worse, the Fed has to demonetize more, which just all these feedback loops start kicking in and the monster starts to come alive. And the farther anything the Fed does, either lowering rates or raising rates, makes the problem worse in different ways. And doing QE or not doing QE makes the problem worse in different ways. And so there's no way to fight. The only way to really fight the dragon is to crash the system. And so they can't do that. And so they're going to continue to feed the dragon until it gets so large that it consumes the system itself.
Feed the dragon. I want to read a little bit more from your work before we roll out. People keep saying that we kicked the can of 2008 down the road. This is wrong. We kicked the can up the stairs, meaning we not only delayed the problem, but made sure it would get worse. Since we borrowed more to paper over the old debts and worthless securities the system had created. A fascinating aspect of our recent financial history is that the bailouts are exponentially growing. This is due to the simple fact that the entity giving the bailout has to have a balance sheet multiples larger than the firm receiving the bailout, and government guarantees of banks induce reckless speculation. For example, to bail out a bank with $10 billion in mark-to-market losses, you need a bank with a $20 or $30 billion capital surplus. To absorb the loss and keep the depositors and creditors satisfied, the bank giving the bailout won't go under. The avalanche is coming either way, and we only have two choices. Either we allow ourselves to be buried under a mountain of hyperdeflation, creating a new Great Depression, frozen credit and equity markets, and massive bank failures, or we burn our way out, using the inferno of money printing and hyperinflation. So I'm curious, what would you prefer? Fast or slow?
I don't want either. But what I'm saying is that there's no other way of an exponential debt spiral, the black hole that the Fed has created. This is the end result. This is how things will run, and there's no way out. We can choose deflation or we can choose inflation. Either way, real value is going to be destroyed, because if you run with deflation and you allow bank failures like SVB, and you don't recapitalize the FDIC, and you don't allow the Fed to do QE, and you see your retirement account goes down by 70%, and half your money in the bank has disappeared from the ledger, that creates a massive depression, and it creates a lot of destruction of economic purchasing power, right? Of real productive purchasing power. But if you do inflation, the same thing happens. And so that was my point. this whole system is finally reaching the end game stages, the last stages of the last death throes of its existence. And so there's not really any good choices to be made. And I don't want this to happen. And a lot of people think that for some reason, because I've written on this so much, or because I've talked about it so much, that I'm somehow cheering this on. I'm not. I think that's going to hurt real people in real ways either way, but it's inevitable. And if this is coming, I'd rather know about it than not. And so what I wrote in that piece is I think that I wrote that in 2021, and that's still relevant right today, because we've seen the collapses of SVB, of Credit Suisse, of Silvergate, of Silicon Valley, and FER and the NFRC. And, that, again, that was a little prelude to what could actually happen if the Fed really raised rates, tapered their balance sheet to zero, the TGA got drained to zero, net liquidity went down, and we saw who really was walking around with no clothes, which is everybody, right? So this is the ultimate dilemma that the Fed and the monetary authorities face, right? Are we going to burn our way out of this debt hole, or are we going to allow ourselves to be buried by it? And I think that with time tree are on the side of the inflationary agenda. And so they're going to burn their way out, which means print whatever it takes.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really curious before I let you go. I know where the Peruvian part of Peruvian Bull comes from, but why did you choose Peruvian Bull? I mean, I'm thinking about the Dollar Endgame and your thesis, and it doesn't sound bullish at the time when you're putting this all together.
Some people think I should be called Peruvian Bear, I guess, right? Look, I was running into this issue in 2017, 2018. I'm doing all this research. I was working for an economics professor doing research on the side in college. And he kept saying I was, a perma bear, and I was insanely pessimistic. But ironically, I'm actually a pretty optimistic person and positive person. I'm just very selective on what I'm positive on. And so I wanted the connotation bull because I wanted to let people know, for one, there's the finance aspect of I'm someone who studies finance and economics, but for two, I'm an optimistic person. I believe that there are ways out of this dilemma that we face. And the one I had before Bitcoin was gold, and I was a complete gold bug and buying gold options and storing gold physically. And now I've become a Bitcoiner. And so that's the life raft that we have, and thank God we have it, because I don't know what else I would do if we didn't have it. So I am an optimistic person, and even though my writings may not sound that way, but I believe I'm trying to convey an important message that people need to hear, and people need to see the negative parts of our financial systems and the dark aspects of the Fed's policy and what it's actually done to people, in the financial economy and the real. And so, yeah, that's where it comes from. And obviously, like we said, Peruvian comes from the fact that, I'm Peruvian. I was raised in the US, but my family is from Lima. And so, yeah, I'm going to be, staying true to that heritage. And ironically, I actually chose this moniker long before I wrote the Dollar Endgame. I chose it in 2019 on Reddit just because I wanted some sort of name that was unique to me. And then 2021 rolls around 2 years later, and I start writing, and people thought that it was a good name, and so I kept it. So yeah,
it is a great name, and you're putting out fantastic work. This has been incredibly dope, Peruvian Bull. We're looking at a monetary event horizon, which I think is one of your pieces, and a really good way of looking at the situation. It's off in the distance, but it's coming. We're moving closer towards it. It's hard to grasp. So I'll leave it to you for any parting words and to let people know where they can find you and your work.
Sure, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Peruvian_Bull, at Reddit in the same tag. I have a Substack, Peruvianbull.substack.com. You can check that out. It's also in my bio. I also have a YouTube channel, which I don't know if you knew about. I'm putting together the video versions of all of my writings slowly, but putting them out there for people to see. So you can go out there and check it out if you want to see like a more interactive or visual version of my writings. And I'm actually planning on quitting my job at my fintech company in August. So just in a few weeks, and I'm going to be doing this full time. And so you should be on the lookout for a lot more content, a lot more threads, a lot more Substack posts, more YouTube videos coming out soon.
Well, congratulations, Mazel Tov, on leaving fiat mining and doing your own thing. That's awesome. Yeah, I've definitely seen your YouTube channel, checked it out, and in your pinned tweet, which has all your fantastic threads, and not all of them, but a lot of the ones that we covered tonight. Yeah. There's a clip that leads you right to YouTube right there. So on the welcome to the Dollar Endgame. So PB, this has been awesome, and I love chatting with you tonight. So thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And just let me know when this comes out. I'd love to share it with everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Sure. Hey, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. I hope that you found it informative and engaging. I'd like to thank you for tuning in and our sponsors for supporting us. Keep building and stay laser focused out there. This is Cedric. Peace.